Major that just dropped. The UK has pulled the plug on free trade talks with Israel.
And impose sanctions too, right? On the West Bank.
Exactly. And this isn't just, a minor diplomatic issue. Things like this can have real knock-on effects for global trade.
Absolutely. It feels like there's definitely more going on beneath the surface here.
Right. It's that intersection of economics and, very tense geopolitics.
Precisely.
So, to get our bearings, we're doing a deep dive using a Fox News report from May 20th, 2025.
Okay.
Now, it's worth remembering, this gives us one particular angle, mostly how Israel is seeing these moves.
That's an important context.
Our mission today is really to unpack it. Why did the UK do this? How did Israel react so strongly? And what are the sort of bigger implications, especially with everything happening in Gaza and the West Bank?
Yeah, trying to cut through the noise and get to the core issues.
Exactly. Give you a solid understanding without getting totally bogged down in every single detail.
Makes sense. So where do we start? The UK's actions themselves?
Yeah, let's start there. What exactly did the UK announce?
Well, the two key things were suspending the free trade agreement talks, which were apparently ongoing.
Okay.
And secondly, bringing in sanctions, specifically aimed at entities in the West Bank.
And the reasoning. What did the UK government actually say?
They flagged two main points of concern. First, Israel's conduct in the war in Gaza.
Right.
They specifically mentioned Operation Gideon's Chariot, calling it, I think the phrase was, a dark new phase. And the second reason.
The second was what they termed the persistent cycle of serious violence undertaken by extremist Israeli settlers in the occupied West Bank.
So, quite direct language there. The report mentions the UK Foreign Minister, David Lammy, speaking to lawmakers.
Yes, he announced the measures in Parliament. He basically said Israel's government actions have made this necessary.
Okay.
And he also brought up Prime Minister Starmer's previous demands for, a lot more humanitarian aid getting into Gaza.
And it wasn't just the UK acting alone, was it? I think others were involved. That's right. There was a joint statement. The UK, France, and Canada.
What did that say?
They were urging Israel to work with the UN to make sure aid delivery could happen properly following humanitarian principles.
And was there a sort of threat attached?
There was, yeah. They mentioned the possibility of further concrete actions if Israel didn't comply on the aid front.
Okay, so quite a coordinated and pretty firm message from those three.
Seems that way.
Right. Let's switch focus then. How did Israel respond? The report mentions a fiery statement. Sounds like they weren't happy.
No, definitely not. One of their first points was actually to downplay the trade talks suspension.
How so?
They claimed those talks had already sort of stalled anyway, even before the UK's announcement.
Interesting. Like trying to say, this doesn't really change much.
That seems to be the implication, yes. But they didn't stop there.
No.
They went on to accuse the UK of actually hurting its own economy with these moves.
Like on what grounds?
They put it down to what they called anti-Israel obsession and domestic political considerations.
Wow, those are very strong words. There's a direct quote in the report, isn't there?
There is. The Israeli Foreign Ministry said, if, due to anti-Israel obsession and domestic political considerations, the British government is willing to harm the British economy, that is its own prerogative.
So basically framing it as irrational and biased.
That's clearly the message they wanted to send, yeah.
What about the sanctions? The ones targeting the West Bank?
Yeah.
Especially, the report mentions that tragic terror attack around the same time.
They condemned those sanctions very strongly, and they did bring up that attack where Seligaz was killed.
Right.
They mentioned doctors were still trying to save her newborn child. The implication seemed to be, why are you sanctioning settlers when this is happening?
A way of highlighting what they see as the real security threats.
Exactly. And they also dismissed the UK's threats of maybe doing more.
How did they dismiss them?
They brought up the end of the British mandate like 77 years ago.
Invoking history.
Essentially saying, we're a sovereign nation now. And they stated, external pressure will not divert Israel from its path in defending its existence and security against enemies who seek its destruction.
So a very defiant stance overall. We'll do what we need to do.
Pretty much sums it up, yes.
Okay, let's pivot to that critical issue. Humanitarian aid for Gaza. The UK specifically called for more aid. What's the situation according to the report?
Well, it notes that Israel had stopped aid flow for quite a while, 11 weeks.
Wow, that's a long time.
It is. But the report also says they had since resumed allowing some aid in, though it's described as limited aid.
Limited? That sounds like a key word there. Suggests it's not enough.
That certainly seems to be the international view, although Israel's UN ambassador Danny Danon is quoted.
What did he say?
He mentioned that the NGOs distributing the aid had given assurances that Hamas wasn't infiltrating their ranks or, taking the aid.
So Israel's trying to show they have concerns about where the aid goes and they're addressing them.
That appears to be the argument, yes. Trying to ensure it reaches civilians.
But despite those assurances, there's still a lot of international pushback on the amount.
Oh, absolutely. The French foreign minister, Jean-Noël Barrot, called the amount insufficient. And the UN Under-Secretary General, Tom Fletcher, used even stronger language. He called it a drop in the ocean of what is urgently needed.
A drop in the ocean. That's stark.
Yes, and he called for significantly more aid.
But wasn't there also a mention of some positive steps, something about the process?
Yes, Fletcher did acknowledge receiving reassurances that our work will be facilitated through existing proven mechanisms.
Okay.
And he also noted Israel had agreed to humanitarian notification measures, basically steps to help keep aid workers safer during operations.
So it sounds like maybe some agreement on the how, but still major disagreement on the how much. Is that fair?
I think that captures the dynamic. Well, yes, the volume is the big sticking point for the international community. Israel seems focused on the security and control aspects.
Right. And it's crucial to remember, like you said, all this diplomacy, these economic moves that are happening because of the actual conflict in Gaza and the ongoing tensions, the violence in the West Bank.
Exactly. They're completely intertwined. You can't separate the diplomatic spat from the situation on the ground.
And, as we established, this specific report gives us mostly Israel's perspective on these UK actions and the international pressure.
It's one piece of a larger puzzle.
Okay, so let's just quickly recap the main points from our deep dive into this report.
Sounds good.
We've got the UK suspending free trade talks, imposing sanctions on the West Bank, their stated reasons, concerns over Gaza, settler violence.
Then Israel's reaction. Very strong condemnation. They call it politically motivated, bad for the UK itself, and downplay the trade talk impact.
Right. And on the aid front, a real split. Israel says limited aid is flowing with safeguards.
But the UK, France, the UN, they're all saying it's nowhere near enough. Urgent calls for much, much more volume.
Yeah, that covers the core conflict points presented here.
Agreed. A concise summary of this particular source.
So maybe here's the bigger question to leave you thinking about. When you have these intense conflicts, how do nations balance their own interests, economic, political, with these urgent humanitarian needs that bodies like the UN are highlighting?
It's a constant tension, isn't it?
It really is. And how do tools like sanctions or freezing trade talks actually play out? What are the real long-term effects, not just for the UK and Israel's relationship, but for the whole region and maybe even global stability?
Yeah, what are the ripple effects down the line?
Exactly. It's a complex web, and this snapshot just shows us one part of a story that's definitely still unfolding.